could ever be done again in Florida or in a different state?
I mean, some of the, you know, the St. Joe, when St. Joe Paper Company, you know, sold off their inventory in North Florida, I really don't think anything like Disney could be done in Florida again, in my estimation. So, in almost any jurisdiction, if you put together the right team, and you get to understand what really drives them, you know, what language, you can get into their process and get out the other end. I struggle when I go up to Palm Beach County because they have this enormous detailed code, and everything has a many part section of processes you have to follow, and it's all driven by consultants. Lawyers are really not all that involved. You need the right consultant who knows the detail of their code, and they know how to upload their plans. It's a very technical, fiddly process. But you know what? If you get the right team, you can get through it. So that's part of working maybe in a multi-jurisdictional business, is understanding that there's not just one way. And even as you get into reviewing zoning regulations for your papers, for your case studies, as we get into the nitty-gritty of tools that you'll find in zoning regulations and the terminology, they don't even use the same definitions, okay? A variance in one jurisdiction can mean something entirely different than the term variance in another city. The standards that they use for rezoning in one city can be entirely different than the standards they review in another. Some of them, I've even seen where they define things differently. And it's, no, you can't start off your effort with dealing with a new jurisdiction with a, dang, you're so stupid, why don't they just do it the way, nope, it's a fresh start every time. They have their policies, they have the community vision that they are being charged to implement. It's just as good as anybody else's, and it's you who must adapt to them. So that's what I want you to, don't make the assumption that you know from one jurisdiction to the next what you're going to encounter. You have to be fairly humble and ask questions and make friends and learn and read, do the work yourself, to read sit in a few public hearings and get a feel for how they go through the approval process. Go to some business, it can be very time consuming, but you need to learn the language that they speak, and you need to run the project the way that projects get approved in that city. And that's all, and there's nothing, it's neither good nor bad, it's just the way that it is. But learning, you do have to spend some time learning a community, because there will be a set of circumstances, there's some history that you'll encounter. In the city of Fort Lauderdale, there were a few projects that caused tremendous upheaval by using their planned unit development zoning. So instead of complying with the traditional standards of a zoning code, a planned development allows you to essentially create your own zoning code for the project. And a few projects were done that way in the city of Fort Lauderdale, and the neighborhoods really, really hated it. And there was this enormous pushback, and they repealed the PUD ordinance and they adopted something else instead. But you did not want to be the one guy who walked in and demanded a right to file a PUD application when that whole process was dying because the community hated it so badly. You have to be sensitive to what's going on in the community where you work and understand what their hot buttons are and find a way to give them what they want. That's not really land use regulation, it's, I don't know, human relations 101. But most of them, I mean, you will encounter extremely hardworking, gifted, brilliant local government staff, and you know, oh man, they are here because they really care about their community. And then you encounter the bureaucrat, the clock in, clock out, seems to be lazy and uninterested in learning anything. And you encounter that in the government realm too, just like everywhere else in the world. But you have to learn to give them what they need. And they'll tell you in their language, and as you're communicating with you in their comments, it'll tell you what they need. They need an impact study on da-da-da-da-da. Maybe their code doesn't really support it, but you know what? If they're asking you for a study, it means this is what I need you to give me, so when I am at the podium, my boss doesn't fillet me in front of the whole city, okay? You need to give me the data for me to protect myself when I'm at the podium in a public hearing. That's what they're really telling you. It has nothing to do with the code. It's saying, you need to protect my back. So you go the extra mile, you give them the study that they need, you give it to them in the way they need it to protect them so they can support your project without being, shot down by elected officials at the podium. So that kind of sensitivity. Okay, we're going to do a little bit of review already of comprehensive planning. This is stuff we covered, and I'm just going to run through it again in a different font. Okay, comprehensive planning, it's authorized by state statute. You find it in Chapter 163 of the Florida statutes. This goes back to some of the history we talked about. Initially, when the 1985 Act was adopted, it was implemented by an administrative code rule called Rule 9J5. You will still, in some applications of cities around the state, find reference to documenting compliance with Rule 9J5. It's been completely repealed. It doesn't exist anymore, but you'll still find remnants of it. It was the administrative rule that the state agency used to measure whether a comprehensive plan or a comprehensive plan amendment satisfied the state requirements. So if you see Rule 9J5, it doesn't exist, but there are still lots of remnants of it back in local government lore. Some of the particulars have been incorporated into the statute itself now. And just like we talked about when Governor Scott was elected and he changed the Department of Community Affairs into the Department of Economic Opportunity, there were a lot of details that had to be included in comprehensive plans in a certain way according to Rule 9J5 that are now no longer requirements and they're local decisions. But comprehensive plans are still mandatory and they still have certain elements that are required to be adopted, implemented, which means you have to have land development regulations that put the plan into effect and enforced by local governments. So this is kind of an overview of what's required to be on a future land use map or in the future land use element. Principles, guidelines, and standards for orderly and balanced future economic, social, physical, environmental, and fiscal development of the area. Big picture. So the future land use map, we've talked about the elements of the comprehensive plan. The one that we deal with most often is the future land use element. It's comprised of text, a compilation of goals, objectives, and policies, and a map. And at a minimum, the future land use map must show the location of permitted uses, and it must be based on professionally accepted surveys, studies, data regarding the area, the land, the projected population, and the character of the undeveloped land, and the availability of infrastructure. So a local government's going to adopt a map, and they have one already in place, and there are, like let's say out in western Palm Beach County, there are vast swaths of agricultural and low-density residential land use. And they want to, and a developer comes in and they want to change the land use, so they want to amend the map to a greater density from a low-density residential to a more suburban density residential. It has to be supported by surveys, studies, and data. So some of the kind of studies that we'll see are population projections. So the comprehensive plan says that We believe that our future land use map will accommodate our projected 10-year population of X. And then you come in and you want to amend it, and the first question is, we don't need more residential density. Our plan says we have plenty of residential density to accommodate our 10-year projected population. How are you going to support this? So you do a study that might do something like show that many other areas were built out far less dense than they were originally planned. Or other, and I'm not an economist or a demographic expert, but you might have to hire an expert to say that whatever, 10 years ago when we set this up in the plan, this is what we expected, but this has changed. And we really do need more housing to accommodate our population, and here's why. So you might have to produce a study like that to support the land use plan amendment that you're proposing to increase the density of residential. Get the idea? And every single land use change could need to be supported by some kind of study like that. The empty commercial strip mall is a very common objection that is raised by communities when a developer wants to come in with they want to convert, let's say, residential to commercial in a certain location. We don't need more empty strip malls. Well, I don't know if that makes sense or not as an objection, but you're going to have to deal with the objection in order to get through public hearings with your amendment. So those are the kind of studies, and much more nuanced studies prepared by many smarter people. But the point of the requirement in the state statute is that the adoption of the plan itself needs to be based on data, not just what we like. We'd like to accommodate this developer who's coming in with a great project. Start with data of what your land is like, what your resources are like, what your population is like now, and what you expect it to be in the future, what kind of community you want to have, and all of those planning things. But you've got to start with data. So if you're going to change it, you're going to need data. These are some of the other required elements. We touched on some of them. Here's a list. Capital improvements element. It has to go at least 5 years. The future and land use element is a bunch of text to support the map. Don't just look at the map. When you're proposing a change to the future land use, you've got to look at the element, the text of the element, and find objectives that are going to be achieved by your amendment. It may say something like direct new development to areas in which infrastructure is available and capacity exists. And your project is in an area where infrastructure exists and capacity is available. So you say, my proposed amendment furthers these goals, objectives, and policies of the comprehensive plan. It is directing development at the area where infrastructure is in place and capacity exists, just like your plan said I should. Those are the kind of things that you have to look for to support your proposed land use plan amendment. Sometimes you want to be the first on the block to convert from a residential to a commercial use. And it's a corner, and it's a great place for commercial, but you're still the first on the block. So you go find policies in the plan about adjacent uses and how requirements that there be buffering and other site plan specific requirements to ensure that adjacent uses are made compatible. And you can address it in your project. You can say, we have to create a yard buffer anyway, so we're going to design it in a way and create an easement on this side to create a buffer to the adjacent, otherwise incompatible use. Those are very good. But that's the idea. You know what project you want. You can see where the objections are going to come from to your proposed land use plan change. And you go to the text of the future land use element and you find policies that your project will advance, that your project will enhance those policies, and you point those out in your application. That's how it works.
In California, Martin Ellis partners doing a redevelopment project. They were okay with redevelopment, but what the community was objecting to was the main tenant or not even the anchoring tenant, but one of the main supermarkets, that their hiring practices. Not that the company was viable, but they got down as minute as to the working conditions for the workers.
It's something that we're seeing a little bit more. There are certain kinds of exactions that we have traditionally associated only with residential development because they bring people. So parks and schools, those are things, you're only going to pay park impact fees, pay school impact fees for residential development because you're bringing people. You know, a commercial development doesn't have any impact on schools. But now we're seeing requests that commercial development address affordable housing because it's a Walmart and Walmart doesn't pay enough for people to afford housing in our community. What are you going to do about it? So the lines are blurring, and the example you cited sounds a bit like that. That again, it's going to be subject. All of those demands are going to be subject to that, dual nexus test that we talked about. It may be something that a developer decides to contribute to or decides to address as a way of making the project palatable to the community. But if you can't do it, you can't do it. You've got to fall back to, can they really require me to do it? Because I have low-wage jobs, can I be made to solve the affordable housing problem in this community? I don't know. Because I hire a lot of people, can I be made to solve the job training needs of this community? Does it really meet the rational nexus test? And again, you decide what you fight and what you yield, but it comes back, all of those new, what else can we ask this developer for that we need in our community? Every time they pull a new one out of their hat, it goes back to the Dolan tests every single time. Transportation element, see, there is a transportation element, it is required. Water, sewer, solid waste, drainage, groundwater recharge, conservation. Conservation elements can be tricky because it starts with an inventory of what you have. And sometimes that opens up old wounds about what's already been destroyed. Okay, so when a natural area has already been developed and there's still a lot of bruising on the soul of the community because of it, they want the conservation element to recover that somehow, so they can fight over the criteria in the conservation element. Recreation and open space, this is where you're going to set a level of service for parks in the community. That's going to be one of those things you're going to have to check off with a residential development, is we're going to generate this many people and we need this many acres for that many people, and this is how we're going to address it to meet the standard of the level of service. The housing elements, they have become pretty heated of late because of the affordable housing crisis. Yes?
Some of those elements that you spoke about that are unique to residential development are now becoming vogue and necessary in mixed-use development. We're seeing that in downtown Miami, where you have a lot of families moving into these luxury condos, and then you got commercials and all of that. They need schools.
Oh, yeah.
And they need parks and open space for their dogs and all of that. So,
Yep.
so there's a shift in some of those elements you're talking about.
No, mixed-use projects, they bring into play all of the requirements for both residential and non-residential, as a matter of course. Coastal management element, intergovernmental coordination. There was a time when they tried to make the intergovernmental coordination element a lot more important. The first time they tried to eliminate the DRI, remember the Development of Regional Impact program? The first time they tried to eliminate the DRI program, they were going to shift it all into an intergovernmental coordination element, and that didn't work for different reasons. But these are the required elements. There can be optional elements. I'm trying to think of other optional elements that I've seen in plans in addition to these. The transportation element can include things like ports and airports, if there is a port or an airport within the jurisdiction, doesn't have to include plans for those facilities. Those facilities get planned separately. I'm trying to think of good examples of optional elements that I've seen. That's coming to me.
It doesn't seem to be anything about like emergency services or hospitals.
That's true. There could be, and it may be that some cities decide to adopt health facility master plans or and so on. And it's funny, emergency services, tend to, they don't have to really answer to anyone. No one's going to say, no one's going to say no firehouse here because it wasn't in our comprehensive plan if you need a firehouse there. But
yeah, but somebody's got to pay for that firehouse.
yeah, and those things do have to get addressed in the capital improvements element. They do. The
How
finance
about
element.
museums and those kinds of ancillary facilities which add to quality of life?
Mhm.
Yeah, libraries and all that, yes.
Well, I think some local governments address some of those things in their recreation and open space element, and they expand it into a cultural type of element. I don't know if Broward County addresses libraries in its comprehensive plan or not. I don't remember. They have, a pretty amazing countywide library system. But those optional things, any of those can be made part of the comprehensive plan. But once they become part of the comprehensive plan, first of all, they have to be supported by studies and data, just like all the required elements. They could be subject to review if the state decides to review them or other state agencies decide to chime in. So they have to become real elements of the comprehensive plan, and you have to really mean it because they become law, just like the required elements become law, and you have to live with them. And some communities, with some of these optional things, they want that. They want the protection for their cultural facilities or something like that, that a comprehensive plan element would provide.
From a public safety standpoint, can a city or deny a request based on the fact that the city's budget will not support additional police officers or other services?
If the city has an established standard, an established level of service, and it can be shown that the proposed project could not meet the level of service, yes, I think they can. Most of the time, it's a wish. It's not that specific. I had a project in Weston where they really wanted us to give land for a fire station, and my partner came along and agreed. I was the one who had to go in and say, no, prove it to me that I was the bad guy. You don't have any adopted plan, you don't have a level of service, there's no basis on which you can ask these $150 million homes to pay for a new fire station, blah, blah. So I was the one who went in and fought the battle, and then she came in with the developer and said, sure, we'll do it. We'll give you your land for a fire station. I'm like, great, I have to be the bad guy. But it happens.
Did they build the fire station?
They're building the project, and I do believe they will be building the fire station. Yeah.
Because they could defer that for 15 years.
That's right.
But they're certainly giving the land. And, even above the local comprehensive plan level are state and regional plans. And they were a big deal when they got adopted as kind of a kickoff to this whole mandatory comprehensive planning process, and they were probably hard fought at the time. And now you would look at them and say, duh, of course we're going to enhance, tourist development without destroying our ecosystem. But it was hard fought at the time to get it into state law.
So the regional, I don't think you have touched on that much. The regional planning, let's say the Tri-County, they have a kind of master plan to control the land use?
The regional plan is more goals, and honestly, I need to look, the regional planning councils have been contracted and their power has been reduced a great deal. a lot of what the regional planning councils did was provide analysis of the development of regional impact. Like, when developments of regional impact existed, the developer would apply to the local government, and then it would be reviewed by the regional planning council staff and heard at that regional level, and then come back to the local government for adoption. So with no developments of regional impact anymore, the regional planning council doesn't have much of a job anymore. They're still working on sort of intergovernmental matters, but there's not a lot left for the regional planning councils to do. Some of them, like the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council, they've made a real job for themselves as a consultancy. They, for fees for local governments all over the state, they act as a consultant on planning issues. They come in, they'll do a downtown plan, they'll hold the charrettes. So they've really become a consultancy to serve local governments rather than the regulatory type of review that regional planning councils were for so long. And here, the South Florida Regional Planning Council, which encompasses Broward, Miami-Dade, and Monroe counties, they really facilitate communication between local governments. I had an issue in Hollywood, and Hollywood was being of an old DRI that had expired, and they weren't really responding to me. They wanted to act like, la, 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 we've never heard of this DRI. So I talked to Jim Murley at the Regional Planning Council. He goes to the guy who's in charge of Broward County at the Department of Economic Opportunity. He calls the Hollywood guy, and all of a sudden I'm getting the answers that I need, and I get the letter that I need, and it was all, so that's what the Regional Planning Council around here is doing, but the Treasure Coast does a lot of hands-on planning assistance for local governments still. So we don't know where, I don't know where the regional planning councils will end up in the long run.
I think they've recently taken on climate change issues, haven't they?
That could be,
Yeah.
it could be. It sounds like that. Okay, so each adopted comprehensive plan is required to be internally consistent. And it's very hard to imagine how you find these inconsistencies, but what can happen is, you know, the transportation element might have maps that show the planned widening of roads, and the land use map might show densities decreasing on the roads where there are planned, you know, there can be mismatches between these elements, and I'm sure it happens all the time, but the goal is to have all of the adopted elements of the comprehensive plan working in concert and supporting each other. And local land development regulations, zoning, subdivision laws, these are required to be consistent with the local comprehensive plan. And then all development orders issued and approved are required to be consistent with the adopted comprehensive plan. So again, it's the hierarchy, right? There's the plan, and there's the zoning and subdivision regulations, and then there's the approvals that come under it. And if a plan, that 22 unit per acre plan is approved in a 10 unit per acre maximum land use, an affected person in the community can file suit based on that, or the state land planning agency can initiate an administrative enforcement action to challenge that. Okay. So this is the hornet's nest of conflicting regulatory agencies that we've been talking about too. Even after you get down, you're dealing with the city, you're working through the city process to get a project approved, it's got consistent zoning, consistent land use, you're getting your site plan process. Other things can create delays and problems for you. If you haven't really looked at the trees, the mature trees on your site, when you did your site plan, you can run into the inability to get a permit to remove the trees, even though you have an approved site plan. Now, they don't really let that happen. They make you go have the tree people look at your plan before they approve your site plan. But their environmental regulations can pop up and bite you at the end of the process if you don't look at them at the beginning of the process. Okay, so this is again review, we talked about this already. Local governments have primary land use regulatory authority in the state of Florida. It's considered to derive from the Florida Constitution grant of home rule power. It does not depend on a specific grant of power from the legislature. So if you open up the Florida statutes and you look for the Zoning Enabling Act, you will not find it. There is no Zoning Enabling Act. In many states, there are. There is a model code, a model zoning enabling act, and in lots of states, their cities do not have home rule power. They have only the power that the legislature gives them by specific statute. In Florida, cities have home rule power. You can do anything that the state doesn't prohibit, and zoning is considered to be one of those home rule powers. They don't need an enabling statute. The regional planning councils still coordinate and attempt to resolve conflicts among local governments. And economic opportunity, formerly known as the Department of Community Affairs, provides whatever degree of state oversight that we still have of comprehensive planning. But their perception, their primary purpose has changed to jobs, right? It's the jobs agency. It's how the governor says jobs have been created in Florida. We will spend more time on another day on environmental regulations, but the environmental, you have to understand that there's nothing that requires the environmental regulatory agencies to work together with the land use regulatory agency. They have regulatory authority that is independent of the land use process, and they administer it without regard to whether you thought you had project approval. So again, you need to create a team that includes whatever environmental scientists you need to anticipate that project, that regulatory process, and plan your project accordingly. You need to know before you start obtaining approvals whether you're going to ultimately need to get approval from the Army Corps of Engineers to fill the wetlands on your site. You need to know that. You're not going to need the permit to get the site plan approved, but you're going to need to know what the requirements will be so you can incorporate them into your site plan. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is a federal agency. It has authority to regulate the waters of the United States. And you wonder, what does that have to do with filling a wetland? Well, if a wetland is a water of the United States, then you can't alter it by filling without a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. There's big battles in federal case law over what the extent of the waters of the U.S. are, but whatever it is, you can't fill it without a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. The State Department of Environmental Protection has regulatory programs. Again, their jurisdiction and the reach of the regulations completely independent from land use regulation. And the fact that you get all the way through your land use approvals doesn't mean that the environmental agency is going to give you any approval. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission is Habitat and Wildlife. And then you see the water management districts. They control drainage programs, flood control, water supply, health departments. I was very late in my career before I really understood that the health department had to approve the potable water connection. And some local governments exercise environmental regulatory authorities, and some do none at all. For example, in Broward County, the same charter that gives the countywide land use plan authority also gives them countywide environmental control. So sometimes and in other parts of the state, there might be no local regulation of environmental matters at all. It's all state agency. So you just got to get the right team of specialists who can tell you what the permitting requirements are for wherever you're working.
I think health departments are also dealing with septic tanks too, not just potable water.
Could be. It's just been so long since septic tanks have been approved anywhere in Broward County. Hardly anywhere. But that could be true too. I don't know how much longer to go with this, and I'm tired of talking.
It's all right. We can go.
Why is it so difficult to work with the Department of Environmental Resource Management? Is it the tasks are difficult, or just the timing? It just takes a long time.
both of those things, and at least, I mean, you may get frustrated by the planners that you work with when you're trying to get a project approved. They understand that their job is to get projects approved. The environmental regulators, that is not their job. Their job is to prevent pollution. And
Save the birds.
to save the birds, to save the manatees, to save the turtles, to protect the air, the water, and the trees. And that's their job. And they don't. It's a say no. They start from a say no process because that's the safest way. So you're just dealing with a very different mindset. And the timing can be difficult too, because while you're going through the land development process, you're refining your project and you're changing things. And you don't want to invest in a fully permitted set of engineering plans until you're absolutely sure where those buildings are going to end up on your site plan. So you've got to get far enough down the land use planning process to settle some basic things about your project, and then you shift it over and you hand it over to your engineers to start going through the permitting process. Your team needs to work together. There can be changes here. There can be changes on the engineering side that don't get communicated to the architect, or that don't get communicated to the land use planner. And then you've got conflicts that you have to resolve later in the permitting process. But you have to understand, a regulator is not a planner. They're not trying to get projects approved. They're trying to make sure you don't pollute.
But somebody needs to tell them that the solution to pollution is dilution.
How long have you been waiting to say that?
I don't understand pollution.
I'm wondering how
My father-in-law does little things like that. He says all the time. So I'm trying to think of other things.
Nothing to talk about.
Well, I do, but I'm really tired of talking, and you're really tired of listening. And
I got a question.
okay.
Obviously,
I'm ready.
you have all these agencies that you need to get permitting requirements from. I mean, does the local government even, are they making sure that you got all that stuff checked off before you even go back to them to get their permits, or no, it's really incumbent on you?
It's always going to be incumbent on the developer to get that. They try, they want to make sure that they don't inadvertently approve something when you didn't have all your ducks in a row, but because they don't want to get blamed for it, they're not, different reasons, but ultimately it's up to the developer to make sure they get their permitting in place when they need it. It's something else to think about when you're putting together a project team. The engineer it may be a very different engineer who's good at helping you get through your site plan process than actually does the permitting plans for the project. Those may be two different people, because one of them requires an understanding of the development approval process and a certain amount of relationship building, maybe even the ability to stand at a podium and testify. And some engineers can do that, and some of them can't. Some of them I would never let near a podium to speak in public. So you have to learn how to use your team and put your team together in that way. And I've done that. I've seen the engineer that works through the site plan process hands over to the engineer that's going to do the actual water and sewer and drainage plans. It's not that unusual. But know who you have, and do not put someone at the podium that can't speak in public. And traffic engineering is the classic example for me. It's very esoteric, and there's only maybe 2 traffic engineers that I know that I would allow to testify in a public hearing. There's many of them that can write fabulous reports and analyze data until the cows come home, but there's only a few of them that can explain it to lay people in a way that will help you in a public hearing. So it's kind of part of the process of managing. The previous slide kind of dealt with who these agencies are and a little bit about what they do. And this one breaks it down more by topic. So transportation can be regulated at the local level by a regional agency that might control a particular expressway or controlled access facility. There's a role to play by the Metropolitan Planning Organization. An MPO is a multi-government agency that is created under federal law. So the federal government says if you want our money for your roads, you need to create an MPO and prioritize the projects for your local multi-jurisdiction area. If you don't want our money, you don't have to, but everybody wants their money. So, and then there's the State Department of Transportation, and they're getting better at planning. They're getting a lot better at planning, but they are really in the we build roads, Missy. That's really what they're all about, and they try to do other things. They have staff that does planning, and they have an aviation staff that tries to do airport planning. But when it comes down to it, the only thing that they really are good at is building roads.
Well, they dole out a lot of money too, to all of them.
They dole out a lot of money through, the federal transit, the federal DOT hands money down to the state DOTs, which hand money down to local governments to build projects or shares in them. On flood control, you'll have cities, drainage districts that might have jurisdiction over multiple cities, and the water management districts, which are created by state law, and there's 5, 6, 7, I can't remember how many now. There's a handful of water management districts that have jurisdiction over the entire state. The water management districts will in turn delegate their authority to local governments that have the capacity, that have the expertise and the experience. In Broward County, any place that's not under the authority of a drainage district, the water management district has given drainage authority to Broward County to issue permits for that. So again, knowing where you are, knowing who has jurisdiction to approve the different parts of your project is a good exercise to go through early on in the planning project, in the planning process.
And from what I see is that, so the developer needs to go through many channels, many, that's it.
It's complex.
Yeah.
It is, and none of them really have any sympathy for the other processes. None at all. It can be very frustrating. It's like, well, no, you have to do it in this order. I'm like, I can't do it in that order because this other one's having me do it in this other order. And they're like, your problem, not mine. So it can be very challenging. They have conflicting things. Go ahead.
A little touchy question. You mentioned about attorneys representing local government or state government and so forth, working with all these interpretation and working with these individuals later on going to private practice representing developers and clients. Is there any conflict of interest, or once you serve in this capacity, you cannot represent clients in that capacity requirement in Florida?
I mean, there might be, I don't know what the requirements are at a state agency right now. There are usually periods of time, maybe a year, maybe 2 years, that you can't represent a client before your agency where you were previously employed for a certain period of time. Sometimes it's only on matters in which you were directly involved. And then for lawyers, they have to, analyze it under the ethical rules that apply to former clients. So it's a little different analysis for a lawyer than for staff. But there are very often blackout periods, but they usually don't put anybody out of work, really.
They need to pay their bills. They have bills to pay.
Yeah.
Right, they can't just sit on the sidelines for a year, they have to do, right. No, it can be, I mean, if they go into consulting or they go to a private industry somewhere, it's a fine line. They find a way to make, to be useful and to make use of their knowledge without violating those rules, but there are some rules. I just don't think that they really prevent a lot of business from getting done in the long run. Trying to think of other ethical issues on movement between agencies. No, and part of it is that the difference between lawyers and other, and government employees generally is most of the government's work is done in the public. There's not a lot of confidentiality issues. So the knowledge that you gain working for a public agency, it's general knowledge, it's public knowledge. You don't have any special or confidential knowledge that can't be applied for the benefit of a private client.
I was thinking more in terms of the peers you used to work with, agencies knowing who does what. Then you're coming back to represent private developers to these peers.
Most of the time, staff to staff isn't prohibited at all. What would be prohibited is appearing before the governing, the agency, the final decision maker. If anything is controlled, it's that. It's usually not, call up and ask a question, ask if we can have a meeting, that kind of thing isn't usually prohibited.
I have a question about permitting. At what point in permitting does the general contractor come in? Because let's say in a situation where you are a developer and you recently acquired a property and you had some trees on the property that need to be relocated, so someone has to get an arborist to do the calculation of how to relocate the trees and all that stuff. Where in the process does the general contractor, because right now I think what we've done is like, we don't get involved till the developer does all the due diligence, pays for impact fees, pays for landscaping, demolition and all that stuff, then we come in. Are we supposed to come in earlier? Because Sierra Fort Lauderdale has this thing where they request a general contractor to file an application for permit.
Well, I mean, as you know, you have to, a contractor needs to apply for a building permit. Whether a contractor would be involved in development approval any earlier than that, it depends on the complexity of the project. There are times when constructability might be an issue as you're laying out a site plan and you would want to confer with a general contractor or bring in a general contractor to evaluate the cost impact of different proposals. So let's say we're going through a site plan approval for a high-rise and we don't think we can get the variance to have the height that we really need to make the project work financially. But the local government says, but you can do underground parking now, and it doesn't count against your height. So you start to evaluate, what would it mean if I put my parking underground to get those extra 2 floors in my height? Yes, you need an engineer, but you might involve your general contractor at that point to understand the cost difference between doing two floors of underground parking versus having a traditional parking garage with the first, okay? That would make sense to me. Now, you're not pulling a permit yet. You don't even have the approval to apply for a building permit yet. But I wouldn't want to redesign my project based on the use of underground parking unless I had a pretty good cost estimate. And yeah, an engineer can provide some of that. But if it's a really fine line, you want to go the extra and get an estimate from a contractor, I think. So there are situations where there are complex constructability questions or decisions to be made that a general contractor would become involved.
Or you would use a design-build type of consortium.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you can, but either way, you're bringing in a contractor
Yes.
to review constructability and cost impact.
Where do you draw the line between the developer and the contractor? And I'm asking, let's go back to the landscaping problem. So let's say the landscaping permit needs to be submitted. The general contractor has to file a master permit for the landscaping contractor to file their own permit. Now, something has to be done by some type of study has to be done by someone on the developer side to determine what trees can stay and what trees can go. Like, what I'm trying to understand is like,
There are certain site-specific things that have to be studied in a site plan process. Some of them, tree relocation will be one of them. If you seek to develop a heavily wooded site, you need to you need to get a tree survey and you need to evaluate how you're gonna dispose of the tree disposition plan to create the footprint that you need for your project. So in that case, you would need to involve them very early because it's gonna govern how you develop, how you lay out your site. Other things like where you put the bushes around the dumpster enclosure and what kind of bush you use around the dumpster enclosure, nobody cares. When, after the site plan is approved and you come in with your building plans and you'll need a landscape plan and you'll have to have the right kind of bushes around your dumpster enclosure then. But at the site plan approval process, nobody cares. So it's a mixed bag. There's always going to be a few issues that would need that expertise to be brought into the site plan review or site plan preparation process, but most of those details you don't need.
What about protected species?
If they exist, you might have to do a survey and determine if they exist, and if they exist, you prepare a plan for how you're going to deal with them, and that goes in with the site plan and moves on along. And you might have to change the whole thing later, but you do it for the site plan process. But you have to resist the urge to get too tied up in the minutia. Get the entitlement. Get the site plan that says you can build so many, tens of thousands of square feet of something. Get it, even if it's not perfect, because when you change it, you're starting from that point. You're not starting from green land anymore. So don't be afraid to get the approval for something that's not completely perfect. Get it, and then amend it. Because you're no longer having the argument about whether anything is going to be built there. You're having the argument about whether it's tilted this way or that. You understand? It's a much smaller fight. Get the entitlement. Do everything you need to do to lock it up. Keep it valid while you work out those other details. And if you go to the market and it doesn't work anymore, then you change it. But you're starting from a new set point.
so basically the developer is responsible for the permits. You guys get to a construction set of plan, then it's the general contractor's responsibility from then on.
Generally, a developer is responsible through final site plan approval. And then they'll hire the contractors to do anything the contractors have to do.
I know, like in his case, you have a tree survey that's approved through the county or the city. It's general contractor responsibility to coordinate with the actual surveyor to ensure they're not knocking down any of those trees that were tagged or are identified on that survey.
Yes, that's true.
I move a lot of trees here on campus.
I'm sorry.
We hired an architect to do, we moved around. We hired an architect to do a tree inventory, and we use that tree inventory to gauge what we're gonna have to do in the future. So, I think your answer was like tree inventory.
Yeah.
Do a tree survey, yeah.
So it all boils down to being forced to do something and not being paid for it.
It's a general contractor.
So that's just my biggest concern, because I had a developer that wanted me to pull the permit and do the landscaping, basically everything I think the developer should do before they got me involved. But we had
And what was written in your contract terms?
you don't have a
And by then, I had moved on to the next project, so.
You know what's funny when you said move on? In Southern California, there was this piece of land, 20 acres, and it was so beautiful. All I wanted to do was put a bench and just go there every now and then and and just sit. Put a septic tank, fence it around, some goats and water, let the Jamaican in me come out. I went down to the county and, because it fell on the county purview. I went down to the county and they started telling me all the different things and so on. I said, what? I just felt like here, donating it to somebody. Who wants to do all of those things? Endangered species and the little juniper trees. I must come up with an inventory of juniper trees. And then when the list started rolling along, I was like, forget it. Forget it. I just hold it until I could sell it. You know? Gee.
Do for you.
You know, and sometimes you find a way. There are, in some of the folks we were talking to about converting golf courses and different things. But sometimes you can have your cake and eat it too. You can do enough of a survey to identify the most sensitive area, and you deed it to them, or you put a conservation easement over it, and you get buy-in that I'm putting a permanent conservation easement here. Let me develop the rest. And sometimes you can reach those kinds of consensus fairly early, because you're coming in at the get-go and offering them something that they consider to be of value. And conservation easements can be crafted to retain your ability, to drain there, or to retain the ability to use it for other support purposes for the development project. So you get the right team together and you get a strategy for how to minimize those demands.
Developers need to learn one of Kenny Rogers' songs. You gotta know when to hold and when to fold.
True.
All right.
All right. I don't know if we're all gonna get put in jail if we break early.
I'll keep mine up. We were actually gonna go work on our project.
If some of you would stay here and work on your projects, I would appreciate it, because I'm going to be here until 4 o'clock and make it look like we had class until 4 o'clock.
I'm sorry, on the materials that you emailed, on the cases that you read, you have, highlighted and underlined, and you have numbers.
That was somebody whose book I was using. That was not
Oh, okay, so there's not.
Don't read anything into those.
Okay.
Yeah, I could have sworn that I got a fresh copy of that book that had a separate scan made of it, but I can't for the life of me.
Want to talk to her? We should go over and talk to her.
I got the book out of our law library. I had a separate scan made of it. No, although I've always valued those kind of things. It's like somebody would sell me that's called land use due diligence. That's called due diligence, yeah.
It's just for me, when I'm running out of email, this is like, sometimes the cities don't know you have to have come in and do inspections for zoning and stuff like that. It takes how long. So it's kind of like you have to run all those right.
Can you text your email in that?
Right, text me if you guys want to work on it. We need Where are we supposed to find you? I think we should get together. Yeah, that way it's I just haven't done it in 5 days. Right now it's like,
You want to finalize our
yeah, she said it's at 3:30.
whatever y'all pick.
We gotta finalize.
Yeah, I'll be,
Oh, you gotta clear two. We got two.
Whatever you want. Whatever you want.
I'm gonna go
No, I
back.
was asking you your name. Or if you finish it today, send me whatever. And then send me the other one.
Yeah, it's been really good.
There's a project in.
Now, I come from a very different experience than you guys. I'm from a background where I had zero knowledge. I was in the Army. It was challenging because the learning curve was a little bit steep, you guys. My entry point was just at a point where they were doing a lot more, I would say advanced, but like, you kind of need to know some of the basics that I just didn't have. So it was challenging, but you see it so often, it's repeated so often, and it's coming from so many different angles. Like she's talking about land use, you're going to do an entire course where you're going to do a project, and you're going to have to find out what you're not going to get it as maybe as quite as complicated as she is. You still have to understand, you know, what that means for the project. So it's just a lot of different directions that's coming at it. It's all budget. I mean, I don't think, I don't think it's definitely not unplanned. If you put the time in, no, if you put the time in, there is one professor who you'll have next semester for capital markets, and he is extremely demanding. He doesn't have any tests, but his case studies get probably 10 hours. If you don't, no, but I'm saying 10 hours. If you don't put in 10 hours,